In the shadow of ancient mountains, where the winds whispered secrets long forgotten, there existed a civilization once brimming with promise and purpose. But the passage of time had taken its toll, and the land now lay in ruins, its people scattered and lost in a sea of despair. Once the traditions of the faithful had anchored the hearts of the people, guiding them through darkness and giving them a sense of hope and unity. Yet now those sacred practices had become mere memories, fading like distant echoes in the wind. The faith that once illuminated the hearts of kings and prophets had slipped away, replaced by idols of false promises and the growing voices of disillusionment. The land, once fertile and abundant, now felt barren. The cries of a people oppressed by their own neglect and moral decay filled the air and carried on the restless winds. Cities that had once been centers of worship, wisdom and justice now stood silent, their temples defiled, their palaces empty. The rulers who once held the power of righteousness in their hands had faltered. Their crowns were no longer symbols of divine authority, but of self-interest and corruption. The priests who were meant to guide the people had themselves turned away from the true path, offering false assurances and leading the masses deeper into darkness. Amid this backdrop of despair and moral disarray, a singular voice would rise, one not born of nobility or power, but of something far more profound, a deep, burning call to truth. It was the voice of one who had witnessed the destruction of a once glorious civilization, the voice of one who sought to uncover the hidden truths buried beneath layers of time and deceit. This was not a leader who sought glory or fame, but one who would be drawn into a cosmic struggle where the stakes were not merely personal ambition, but the very survival of faith and truth itself. This is where our story begins. Not with a kingdom at war, not with armies clashing upon the fields of battle, but in the heart of a man wrestling with the very meaning of his existence. His name was not yet known to the world, but his journey would reshape the course of history. This man was not destined to lead an army or wear a crown, but rather to bring to light a book, the Book of Jasher, a work so ancient and sacred that its very existence had been lost to time. A book whose pages held the keys to the divine plan, whose words, though forgotten, still carried the weight of truth. But why was it hidden? Why had it been cast aside, left to decay while false teachings flourished, and what secret knowledge lay buried within its pages? The Book of Jasher was not just a chronicle of events and battles, it was a record of the spiritual struggle of mankind. It told of the unseen forces that shaped the destiny of nations, of the divine interventions that guided or thwarted the choices of rulers and prophets. It was a story of faith, of the clash between light and darkness, of the battle for the very soul of humanity. And though it had been forgotten by the world, it had never truly been lost. Its truths had simply been concealed, waiting for the right moment, waiting for the one who would dare to uncover them. Our story takes us to that moment, a time of deep moral and spiritual crisis, a time when the people had forgotten the very foundation of their faith. It was a time of doubt and division, where the powerful sought their interests and the weak were left to perish in the streets. The book, once a living testimony of divine revelation, was now buried beneath the weight of human sin and pride. And yet, against all odds, one young man would rise to challenge the forces that had led his people astray. He was not born into power, nor did he have an army at his back. He had only the words of the Book of Jasher, the ancient wisdom contained within its pages, and the unyielding conviction that the truth, no matter how hidden, must be brought into the light. This leader, whose story we're about to follow, was one of many who had seen the world around them crumble. Yet, unlike the others, he felt a call that would not be silenced, a call to uncover the secrets of the past, to bring forth the truth that had been concealed for so long. His journey would not be easy. The forces of darkness that had taken root in his world were powerful, and they would stop at nothing to keep the truth hidden. But with every step he took, he would uncover not only the mysteries of the Book of Jasher, but also the hidden strength within himself. As he set out on his journey, he was met with resistance at every turn, doubts from his people, fears from those who held power, and challenges that seemed insurmountable. But in his heart, he knew that the path he walked could not be ignored. The Book of Jasher, though hidden and forgotten, contained the answers that his people desperately needed. It was a book that would not only reveal the history of their ancestors, but also guide them back to the true path of righteousness. Its pages held the wisdom of generations, the lessons learned from the mistakes of the past, and the divine revelations that would restore their faith. But why had such a book been concealed? Why had it been deemed unworthy of public knowledge, relegated to the shadows of history? The answers lay within the pages, waiting to be uncovered, but only by those willing to sacrifice everything to reveal the truth. As we follow the story of this leader, we are drawn into a world where the battle between light and darkness is not only fought in the streets and palaces, but also within the hearts and minds of individuals. His struggle is not just external, but internal as well. To uncover the secrets of the Book of Jasher, he must first confront his doubts, his fears, and the darkness that threatens to consume him. It is a journey that will test his faith, his resolve, and his very soul. This is not just a story of one man's quest to uncover a hidden book. It is a story of redemption, of faith in the face of adversity, and of the unrelenting pursuit of truth in a world that has forgotten it. The Book of Jasher, though buried for centuries, will rise again, and through it, the people will be given a chance to reclaim their faith and their future. But the road to redemption is never easy. It is paved with trials, sacrifices, and moments of doubt. And yet, for those willing to walk it, the rewards are beyond measure. Amid a world lost in darkness, one man's journey will light the way for generations to come. His story will inspire, challenge, and ultimately change the course of history. The truth, no matter how long it is hidden, will always find its way to the surface, and when it does, it has the power to change everything. In the world before the great upheaval, the land was shrouded in a veil of despair. The once glorious civilizations, rich in culture and faith, were now mere shadows of their former selves. Their people, once vibrant and full of hope, had become weary. Their spirits sagged under the weight of corruption and the decay of belief. For decades, they had strayed from the righteous path, lured by false gods, broken promises, and the empty allure of power. The land, once fertile and blessed, now seemed barren, as if the very earth itself had turned away from the cries of its people. At the heart of this decline were the leaders who had forsaken their sacred duties. Kings, priests, and prophets had all fallen victim to greed, lust, and the hunger for control. No longer did the words of the sacred scrolls hold the weight they once had. The divine laws, which had been the foundation of the land, now lay forgotten, their wisdom lost in the tides of time. The people had become disillusioned with their leaders, their once great faith now a hollow echo, a distant memory of a better time. Yet, even amidst this spiritual collapse, there was a flicker of hope. It was in the form of a forgotten book, an ancient text known as the Book of Jasher. Once revered as a key to understanding the world and the divine, it had been hidden away, its truths obscured by the sands of time. It was said that this book contained not only the stories of the great heroes of the faith, but also the wisdom of a time when the world was still in harmony with the Creator. But the Book of Jasher was not just a relic of the past, it was a beacon of hope for those who dared to seek the truth. Its pages were believed to hold the answers to the deep spiritual questions that haunted the land. The question that had plagued so many for generations: why had the land fallen into ruin? Why had the divine abandoned them? Could potentially find answers within its ancient verses. This is where our protagonist enters the story. Born into a world broken by betrayal and decay, they were not figures of power or wealth, nor someone of noble birth. Instead, they were an ordinary person, a child of the earth, raised by humble means. They had witnessed the fall of their people firsthand, seen the pain of the families torn apart by injustice, and the hopelessness that gripped the hearts of the people. Like so many others, they had asked the same question: what had gone wrong? This protagonist, unnamed for now, grew up amid the collapse. They were raised by parents who, though devout, were no longer sure of the path they walked. Their faith had been shaken by the actions of the very leaders who were supposed to guide them. From a young age, the protagonist felt a pull, a yearning for something greater, something deeper than what the world had to offer. They felt the stirrings of a divine call, but it was not easy to heed. It would not be easy to defy the way of the world. In their youth, the protagonists had been quiet and introspective, always observing, never quite fitting into the world around them. While others participated in the rituals of the day, they questioned everything. The words of the priests, the actions of the kings, the promises of the prophets. They saw a world in chaos filled with contradictions. They could not accept the reality that was laid before them. Something had to be wrong. Something had to be out of place. It was not until a moment of crisis, when the protagonist faced personal loss, that the yearning for truth began to burn within them. It was amid sorrow and pain that the protagonist first heard whispers of the Book of Jasher. It was said to be hidden, lost, or buried, but the stories of its power and wisdom could not be suppressed. A few spoke of it in hushed tones, calling it a treasure of lost knowledge, an ancient relic that had the potential to change everything. For those who dared to believe, it was a hope that had not been extinguished. But why was the Book of Jasher hidden away? Why had it been lost to the ages? The answers were not so simple. It had been suppressed, lost not just because of the passage of time, but because of those in power who feared its truth. The Book of Jasher told of events and people whose stories were too powerful and too challenging for the rulers of the day to accept. It spoke of truths that could not be ignored, of divine intervention that challenged the status quo, and of heroes who defied the odds to restore righteousness in the land. It was a book of revelations, one that could bring about great change, but only at great cost. As the protagonist learned more about the Book of Jasher, the questions they had always asked began to form into a singular purpose: to uncover the truth hidden within its pages. But to seek the book would not be easy. Those who had controlled the land would stop at nothing to prevent its rediscovery. The authorities would see it as a threat, just as they had with any movement or idea that challenged their grip on power. It was not just a quest for knowledge, it was a battle for the soul of the land itself. As the world around him descended deeper into chaos, a sense of urgency gripped the heart of the protagonist, Noah. The moral decay of his time was undeniable, and yet, amidst this growing darkness, a flicker of light remained within him. He saw the suffering of his people, the desperation in their eyes, the cries of the innocent swallowed by the storm of their collective sins. This darkness was not just external, it was internal, a corruption of spirit that ran through every aspect of their society. But Noah was different. Though he was born into this corrupt world, his heart remained pure, untouched by the temptations that led others astray. It was this purity that set him apart, and perhaps, in the eyes of the divine, it was the very reason he had been chosen to carry out the monumental task that lay ahead. His faith, though unwavering, was not without doubt. There were moments when he questioned the path he was on. How could one man possibly stem the tide of evil that had overwhelmed an entire civilization? The cities of the plains, Sodom, Gomorrah, and their neighboring towns, were prime examples of the moral decay that gripped the land. The once prosperous and righteous cities had become synonymous with sin, their citizens consumed by pride, greed, and lust. Noah, a humble man by nature, could not fathom the depravity that had taken root in his neighbors' hearts. It was not only their actions that offended the heavens, but the very essence of their being. The whispers of corruption had spread like a virus, infecting every facet of society. While Noah witnessed the downfall of these cities, he also saw the spiritual decline in his own family. His sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, were not yet lost to the ways of the world, but they struggled with their faith and their role in the divine plan. Ham, the youngest of the three, was particularly susceptible to the influences around him. He was rebellious, often questioning the righteousness of their mission, and the burden that Noah bore began to weigh heavily on the entire family. Yet Noah's determination never faltered. He knew the time would come when he would have to take action, when his family's faith would be tested, and the call to fulfill his divine mission would become undeniable. It was in the midst of this struggle, this balancing act between his unwavering faith and the human doubts that clung to him, that Noah received the command, a command so monumental that it would change the course of history. In that moment of clarity, Noah saw not only the despair of the world around him, but also the fragility of his faith. Could he truly carry out the task before him? Would he be able to warn the people in time? Was he the only one who could save humanity from itself? As the days turned into weeks and then months, Noah's internal struggle grew. It was as though the weight of the world rested upon his shoulders, and every decision, every step he took, brought him closer to his divine calling. But Noah was not alone in this dark world. His righteous stand against sin and corruption drew the attention of those who sought to undermine him. The same forces that had driven the cities of the plains into ruin began to close in on him, mocking his message of hope, calling him a fool for trusting in a future that seemed so distant, so improbable. These voices of doubt and ridicule were not merely external. They came from those closest to him, those he had trusted most. In his heart, Noah understood that the decision he faced was more than just a battle against the forces of evil. It was a battle within himself. He had to wrestle with the doubts that whispered in his mind, the fears that gnawed at him in the silence of the night. But even in the darkest moments, when the world seemed on the brink of destruction, Noah remained steadfast. His faith, though tested, did not waver. The divine command was clear. The flood would come, and Noah would be the instrument of salvation. But what did salvation truly mean in such a world? Could a single family truly restore hope to humanity? Or was Noah's mission simply to preserve what little purity remained? As he pondered these questions, the images of the cities he had known and the people he had loved haunted him. Would he truly be able to see the end of the world as he knew it? Noah was no stranger to loss. He had seen it in his travels, in his relationships, and the very air around him. It was not the first time he had faced heartbreak, nor would it be the last. But this loss was different. The weight of the decision he was about to make would alter not just his life, but the entire course of humanity. In this time of profound inner turmoil, Noah sought comfort in his faith. It was his unshakable belief in the Creator that gave him the strength to endure. He prayed for guidance, asking for the courage to follow through on the task set before him. But even as he prayed, he felt the burden grow heavier. Could he truly trust in the divine plan? Was he worthy of the task that had been placed upon him? And so, as the world around him crumbled and the moral fabric of society disintegrated, Noah took the first steps toward fulfilling his mission. With each step, the doubts grew fainter, replaced by a fierce sense of purpose. The path ahead would not be easy, and the challenges would be many, but Noah knew that the world's only hope lay in his unwavering commitment to carry out the will of the Creator. Noah's early life was far from ordinary. Born into a world ravaged by corruption and filled with the loud cries of suffering, Noah's existence began with the weight of an unimaginable future hanging over him. As a child, the earth around him seemed to teem with despair, yet there was always a sense of calm within his soul, a whisper calling him to something greater. But as he grew, the internal conflict between his peaceful heart and the external chaos surrounding him only intensified. The world that Noah inhabited was a far cry from the life of faith and purity that one might imagine. The descendants of Adam had multiplied, and with their growth came the degeneration of their morals. Humanity had lost its way. Society was teeming with violence, immorality, and idol worship. It was a time when mankind had become increasingly estranged from the Creator, and the earth groaned under the weight of its inhabitants' corruption. Noah's father, Lamech, had seen the deterioration of the world with his own eyes. A man of wisdom, he had lived through the tumultuous reign of many kings and witnessed the decay of the world's spiritual fabric. His father, Methuselah, had been a man of extraordinary longevity and wisdom, and from him, Lamech had learned of the deep mysteries of God's creation. But even Lamech felt helpless in the face of the overwhelming evil that now filled the earth. And so it was that Noah's birth was marked by prophecy. The elders spoke of a child who would be the one to restore righteousness and save a world teetering on the brink of destruction. But Noah was too young to comprehend the significance of his destiny. The world around him only made him question his purpose. He often found himself pondering the mystery of the Creator's plans and wondering why he had been chosen for such a monumental task. Could he, a mere man, withstand the weight of such a responsibility? Noah's childhood was not one of luxury or comfort. Instead, he was raised in the shadow of a world that was falling apart. As a young boy, he would often wander the vast fields near his home, searching for peace in the quiet of nature. But even in the serenity of the land, Noah could not escape the pain of what was happening around him. The cries of the oppressed, the shouts of the corrupt kings, and the pervasive sense of darkness haunted him. Yet, amidst all this, he found solace in the teachings of his father. Lamech had always encouraged him to embrace faith, to trust in the goodness of God, and to look beyond the temporary chaos of the world. Despite the challenges that plagued him, Noah never doubted the existence of a higher power. His belief in God was unwavering, even as he faced the harshness of reality. But it was not always easy. He was often ridiculed by others for his faith and his refusal to partake in the sinful pleasures that were so prevalent in the world around him. Friends mocked him for his devotion, and society scorned him for his refusal to conform. At times, the weight of this isolation became unbearable. Noah would retreat into the quiet corners of his home, questioning his path, wondering if he was truly capable of fulfilling the task that had been placed before him. But as Noah grew older, something began to stir within him. The doubts that had plagued his early years slowly began to fade. He began to sense the calling that would lead him to become the man that the world so desperately needed. It was in his solitude that Noah found clarity. His faith became the anchor that held him steady in the storm, and he began to realize that his purpose was far greater than his doubts and fears. It was during these years of internal struggle that Noah met his greatest influence, his grandfather, Methuselah. A man of incredible wisdom, Methuselah had witnessed the rise and fall of many nations, and he had seen the deep corruption of humanity. Despite his age, Methuselah's mind remained sharp, and he often shared stories of the Creator's power and the importance of staying true to one's faith, no matter the circumstances. Methuselah was a guiding light for Noah, showing him that even in the darkest of times, there was always hope. Through his grandfather's teachings, Noah began to understand that his destiny was not a burden, but a gift. The Creator had chosen him to lead, to restore balance, and to stand as a beacon of righteousness in a world drowning in sin. But it wasn't just the wisdom of his grandfather that influenced Noah, it was the example of his father. Lamech, though deeply troubled by the state of the world, had never lost his faith in God. He had always trusted that divine intervention would come, that there was a plan greater than anything humanity could fathom. Lamech had taught Noah the importance of patience, humility, and the need to listen to the divine whispers that would guide him through the storm. However, despite the teachings of his father and grandfather, Noah still found himself questioning the path laid out before him. He couldn't escape the feeling that he was simply too small, too insignificant to carry such a monumental burden. How could he be the one to save the world? What power did he possess that could stand up to the overwhelming darkness that consumed the land? The more he reflected on these questions, the more he felt the weight of his destiny bore down on him. He began to struggle internally, torn between the knowledge of what he was meant to do and the doubt that gripped his heart. This internal conflict became even more pronounced as he witnessed the depths of humanity's sin. His heart broke as he saw the violence that pervaded the earth. Every corner of society was tainted by corruption, and the once pure world that had been created was now a shadow of its former self. The gods of the people had turned into idols, their worship filled with debauchery and pride. The cries of the poor, the helpless, and the oppressed rang in his ears, but Noah's hands were tied. There was nothing he could do to stem the tide of sin that seemed to engulf everything in its path. Yet even in his darkest moments, Noah never lost his faith. The teachings of his father and grandfather, the quiet voice of God within his heart, reminded him that his purpose was not just to survive, but to lead. He would have to rise above the darkness, to shine a light amid the storm. It was in these early years, amid doubt and struggle, that Noah's faith grew stronger. He realized that the challenges he faced were not obstacles, but the very things that would prepare him for the great mission ahead. As Noah continued to reflect on his purpose, the weight of his destiny became ever clearer. He knew that he could not turn back, and he could not allow fear to rule him. The world needed a savior, and he was the one who had been chosen. The doubts that once haunted him now seemed insignificant compared to the clarity of the task at hand. As Noah's understanding of his purpose deepened, the challenges he faced became even more pronounced. The world around him, once filled with beauty and hope, now appeared darkened by the corruption that had gripped it. It was not just the physical decay that troubled him, but the spiritual decay, the sense of despair and hopelessness that plagued every corner of society. Humanity was living as though there were no consequences to their actions, and each day that passed seemed to push the world further into the abyss. Noah felt it deeply in his heart. The calling he had received was no longer just a whisper in his soul, it was a resounding voice, urging him to take action. Despite his growing awareness of his mission, Noah's early years were marked by internal conflict. He was a man of deep convictions, yet he could not escape the temptations and distractions that the world offered. There were moments when he longed for the carefree days of his youth, where life had seemed simpler and the future less daunting. The weight of the task ahead often seemed unbearable, and there were times when he questioned whether he was truly equipped to handle such a monumental responsibility. It was during this time of questioning that Noah began to notice the cracks in the world around him. The kings and rulers of the earth, once powerful and influential, were now seen as little more than tyrants, fueled by greed and a thirst for power. The rich oppressed the poor, and the weak had no voice in the courts of the mighty. The earth had become a battleground for the desires of men, with little regard for righteousness or justice. Noah could not ignore the suffering of those around him, and yet he felt helpless, unsure of how to begin the daunting task of restoring order to such a broken world. In the face of such overwhelming odds, Noah's faith became his anchor. It was the teachings of his father, Lamech, and his grandfather, Methuselah, that kept him grounded. These men had lived through trials and tribulations of their own, yet they had never wavered in their belief in God. They had witnessed the slow erosion of the world, but they had also witnessed the faithfulness of the Creator, who had never abandoned his people. It was this unshakable trust in God that Noah began to rely on in those moments of doubt. He could not change the world by his strength, but he could trust in the Creator's plan. The belief that God had chosen him for a specific purpose began to solidify in Noah's heart, and with each passing day, he grew more certain that he was not meant to remain a passive observer, but an active participant in the restoration of the earth. One of the most significant moments in Noah's early life came when he experienced a divine revelation, a moment when the Creator's presence became undeniable. It was a quiet evening, and Noah had been walking through the fields near his home, reflecting on the weight of his purpose. As he stood in the stillness, the voice of God came to him, not in thunder or lightning, but in a whisper that seemed to resonate within his very soul. It was then that Noah understood with absolute certainty that the time had come for him to take action. This revelation was a turning point for Noah. No longer was he a young man torn between doubt and faith. He was now a man on a mission with a clear understanding of what needed to be done. He had been chosen to rebuild the earth, to lead a remnant of humanity through a period of destruction and renewal. The task ahead was daunting, but Noah no longer viewed it as a burden. He viewed it as an opportunity to fulfill his calling, to serve the Creator, and to restore the world to its rightful state. With this newfound clarity, Noah began to prepare for the monumental task that lay before him. He began to study the ancient scriptures that had been passed down through generations, seeking wisdom and guidance from those who had walked before him. He also sought the counsel of his father and grandfather, both of whom had seen the decline of the world and understood the depth of the challenges Noah would face. They shared their insights and wisdom with him, reminding him that the task at hand could not be accomplished alone. He would need the support of others, men and women who were willing to stand with him in faith and righteousness. As Noah began to gather his thoughts and plans, he also began to recognize the spiritual forces at play in the world around him. It was clear to him that the forces of evil were at work, undermining everything good and pure. The wickedness of mankind was not just a human failing, it was the result of a deeper spiritual battle, one that had been raging since the beginning of time. The idols that people worshipped were not merely statues of stone and wood. They were symbols of the spiritual darkness that had taken root in the hearts of men. The evil that had infected the world was not just a physical reality, it was a spiritual one. And it was this spiritual battle that Noah would need to confront if he was to fulfill his mission. Despite the overwhelming nature of this challenge, Noah was determined to rise to the occasion. His heart burned with a passion for righteousness, and he knew that he could not remain silent in the face of such evil. He would have to be bold, even in the face of mockery and opposition. He would have to build the ark, despite the ridicule of those who would surely mock his faith and the magnitude of the task he was undertaking. Yet, Noah's determination was unwavering. He knew that this was the only way to save humanity, to preserve the Creator's creation, and to ensure that righteousness would have a place in the world once more. But Noah was not without his doubts. As he began to share his vision with others, he encountered skepticism and ridicule. The world had become so consumed by its desires and lusts that the idea of a coming judgment seemed absurd to them. Noah's warnings were met with laughter and disdain, and many tried to convince him to abandon his mission. They mocked him for his faith, for his conviction, and for his refusal to conform to the ways of the world. Yet Noah remained steadfast. He had heard the voice of God, and that was enough to carry him through the storm of opposition. He knew that he had been chosen for a divine purpose, and he would not allow the mockery of others to deter him from fulfilling it. The tension between Noah's faith and the world's corruption continued to grow, but with each passing day, his resolve became stronger. The Creator had entrusted him with a task that was larger than anything Noah could have imagined, but Noah knew that with God's help, he could accomplish the impossible. The journey ahead would be long and filled with trials, but he was ready. For the first time in his life, Noah felt fully prepared to embrace his destiny. The wind howled through the ancient desert, carrying with it whispers of the past, secrets buried deep in the earth for millennia. The world seemed to hold its breath as if awaiting something monumental to unfold. Amid this timeless silence stood the protagonist, a young leader on the brink of destiny, unaware that the moment he had been waiting for was about to crash down upon him like a storm. He had been struggling, torn between his duties and the confusion swirling in his heart. The weight of his people's suffering pressed heavily on his shoulders, and the burdens of leadership had taken their toll. He felt disconnected from the divine calling that had once seemed so clear. Questions filled his mind, doubts clouded his spirit, and every decision felt like a gamble in a game with high stakes. The world around him seemed to mock his efforts, as though the more he tried to stand firm, the deeper he sank into despair. But everything changed in a single moment. It came not in the form of an angelic visitation or a booming voice from the heavens. Instead, it arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the shape of an ancient scroll that had been hidden away for centuries. The old man who presented it to him was frail, his hands trembling as he passed over the weathered parchment. The scroll's leather casing was cracked and faded, but it carried an energy that seemed to pulse with the weight of time. Its significance was immediately apparent. This was no ordinary scroll. This was a message from the past, a record of secrets long forgotten. The old man's voice trembled as he spoke. "This is the key," he said, "the answer to the questions that plague you. It holds the truth you've been seeking, the path you must follow." He stepped back, his words hanging in the air like a heavy mist. The protagonist reached out, his fingers brushing against the scroll, and in that instant, something shifted within him. It was as if the world tilted, the ground beneath his feet suddenly unstable, and yet, amid this disorienting shift, he felt an undeniable pull. The scroll beckoned him, urging him to open it, to see the truth that lay within. He took the scroll in his hands, his heart racing as he unfurled the brittle paper. The writing inside was archaic, but it wasn't the language that shook him to his core. It was the message. As he read, a deep sense of clarity washed over him. The words were not just a prophecy, they were a revelation. They spoke of his destiny, of the trials he would face, and of the divine forces that would guide him. But there was more, a darker truth hidden within the folds of the text, a truth that left him breathless with fear. The scroll told of a betrayal, one that would come from within his closest circle. Someone he trusted, someone he loved, would turn against him. The betrayal would not be a simple act of treachery. It would be the catalyst for a series of events that would shake the very foundation of his beliefs and test his faith in ways he never imagined. He could feel the weight of the words bearing down on him, pressing into his chest, suffocating him with the knowledge of what was to come. This was the moment of no return, the moment when everything he had worked for, everything he had believed in, was about to be shattered. But as the gravity of the revelation settled into his soul, something else stirred within him. A flicker of resolve, a glimmer of understanding. He had been chosen not for the strength of his arm, nor the power of his kingdom, but for the strength of his spirit. He was called to something greater than himself, something far beyond his desires and fears. The path ahead would be fraught with hardship. But the answers he had sought for so long were now clear. The scroll was more than a warning. It was a guide, a map for the road ahead. It laid out the choices he would have to make, the sacrifices that would be required, and the darkness he would have to face. It was not just a tale of woe, but a promise of redemption. For through the betrayal, through the darkest moments, there would be a chance for something greater, something more divine. As the protagonist sat there, staring at the scroll, he felt a surge of emotion, unlike anything he had ever known. Fear and hope intertwined within him, like two forces locked in eternal struggle. The revelation had changed him and had forced him to confront not only the world around him, but the depths of his soul. He had never expected the road to salvation to be so treacherous, so filled with peril. But now, there was no turning back. The truth had been laid before him, and it was impossible to ignore. For hours, he sat in silence, contemplating the weight of what he had learned. He had been given the knowledge of what lay ahead, but now the real question remained. Could he rise to the challenge? Could he trust the divine path set before him, even when it meant facing betrayal, hardship, and the loss of everything he held dear? The storm outside raged on, but inside, there was a quiet resolve beginning to take shape. He would face the darkness. He would not let the shadows consume him. With the scroll as his guide, he would walk the path of destiny, even if it meant walking alone. The choice was his now, and the future would be forged in the fire of his decisions. As the protagonist sat alone in the dimly lit chamber, the weight of the scroll still heavy in his hands, the world around him seemed to fade into the background. The air was thick with the scent of ancient paper, and the candlelight flickered with an unsettling eeriness. His mind raced, unable to process fully what had been revealed. Every word he read echoed in his mind like the tolling of a distant, clear, undeniable and foreboding. The betrayal, the very core of the prophecy, stared back at him from the faded ink of the scroll. The person he trusted the most, the one he had regarded as a confidant and ally, was destined to become his greatest enemy. The thought seemed impossible. How could it be? He had shared his deepest thoughts, his innermost fears, with this person. They had stood side by side through countless trials, facing the darkness together. How could this relationship, built on years of trust, be so easily torn asunder? It was not just any betrayal. It would pierce the heart of everything he believed in. The prophecy spoke not only of betrayal, but also of the consequences that would follow. The world would change. The foundations of the kingdom would tremble, and with it, the delicate balance of peace he had fought so hard to maintain would collapse. The words from the scroll danced in his mind, refusing to let him rest. He could see the faces of those around him, the ones he called friends, comrades, and brothers in arms. Each face was now etched with suspicion, with a shadow of doubt he had never allowed himself to entertain before. Who could be trusted? Was anyone truly who they seemed? Could he even trust himself? The realization hit him like a thunderclap. The betrayal would not be a single, isolated act. No, it would be the beginning of a chain of events that would unravel everything. He had been chosen, yes, but not for the victory he had envisioned. He had been chosen to endure the greatest of losses, to experience firsthand the agony of deception and the heartbreak of watching those closest to him turn against him. This was his test, and it would not be easy. For the first time, the protagonist felt the true weight of the responsibility placed upon him. This was not just a battle of armies or kingdoms. It was a battle of wills, hearts, and souls. It would require more than just strength and courage to survive. It would demand sacrifice, humility, and unwavering faith in the face of overwhelming odds. And even then, success was not guaranteed. There were no promises of triumph, only the certainty of trials and tribulations. His mind shifted to the past, the early days when he first began to walk this path. Back then, it had been so clear. The road ahead was bright with purpose, filled with hope and a vision for a better world. But now, as the scroll's ominous words settled deeper into his soul, he began to see the cracks in his resolve. He had always believed in the righteousness of his mission, but now, with this revelation before him, he was confronted with the harsh reality of what that righteousness would cost. The hours passed as he grappled with this new understanding. Outside, the storm had not relented, and the wind continued to howl as if in response to the chaos brewing in his heart. It was a storm of doubt and fear, but also of determination. He had been chosen for a reason. He had been entrusted with a mission, one that required him to face not just the external forces that sought to destroy him, but the internal forces of betrayal and despair that threatened to break him from within. Suddenly, the door to the chamber creaked open, breaking the heavy silence. His closest ally entered, the very person who had once shared his dreams of a better world. The protagonist's heart skipped a beat. Was this the one who would betray him? Could it be that the face before him now would be the one that would ultimately bring about his downfall? But no, he thought, shaking his head. He couldn't believe it. Not yet. He had to be certain. The prophecy had spoken of betrayal, but it had not yet named the betrayer. Was it this man or someone else in his inner circle? There was no way to know for sure. Not yet. But he had learned enough to understand the gravity of the situation. Whoever it was, the consequences of this betrayal would be far-reaching, and he would need to be prepared for the storm that was about to engulf his world. His ally, noticing the tension in the room, stepped forward, concern etched on his face. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice laced with genuine care. But even as the words left his mouth, the protagonist felt a chill run down his spine. He searched the man's eyes, looking for any sign of the treachery the scroll had warned him about. But the face before him was as innocent as it had ever been, too innocent. Was this the moment when everything would change? He struggled with the question. The revelation from the scroll echoed in his mind once more, urging him to trust in the prophecy. But his heart rebelled against it. How could he distrust someone he had fought beside, someone who had never given him a reason to doubt their loyalty? Yet, the prophecy had been clear. The betrayal would come from within. His ally placed a hand on his shoulder, breaking the protagonist's reverie. "You seem lost in thought," he said gently. "What troubles you?" The protagonist swallowed hard. He had to be careful, he reminded himself. He couldn't reveal the knowledge he now carried. To do so would be to risk alienating those around him, even if they were not the betrayers. The darkness was closing in, but he could not yet reveal what he knew. "I'm just thinking," he replied, his voice betraying a hint of weariness. "There's much to consider." His ally nodded, clearly not sensing the storm brewing within the protagonist's soul. "Well, if you ever need to talk, I'm here. We're in this together, remember?" Those words, once a source of comfort, now felt like an insidious whisper, sending a shiver down his spine. Could he trust this man? Could he trust anyone? As the ally left the room, the protagonist remained seated, his heart heavy with doubt and fear. The storm outside raged on, and in his chest a storm of his own began to build. The revelation was clear. The path ahead was not the one he had envisioned, but it was the one he had to walk. The test was coming, and he would face it, no matter the cost. The days that followed were filled with an oppressive silence, a heavy stillness that settled over the protagonist like an unspoken burden. The prophecy had given him a glimpse of what was to come, and yet the road ahead remained unclear. His mind wrestled with the paradox of the future he was destined to face. How could he reconcile the man he had always been with the person he would need to become? Was he ready to carry the weight of this revelation and the fallout that would inevitably follow? The very thought of confronting betrayal was overwhelming. The closer he got to the truth, the deeper the chasm of uncertainty seemed to grow. If the prophecy was right, and there was no reason to doubt it now, he would lose everything he had fought for, his friendships, his sense of security, and perhaps even his sense of self. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the stone floor, the protagonist stood alone in the courtyard. The cool night air brushed against his face, as though nature itself sought to offer solace in this moment of anguish. But it was in solitude that the weight of the prophecy truly began to take root. Alone with his thoughts, he had no distractions, no comforting words to shield him from the truth. He was on the precipice of something monumental, something that could either break him or transform him forever. As he looked up at the vast expanse of the sky, a familiar figure appeared in the distance, a figure he had grown to trust above all others. His closest ally, the one who had stood by him through the darkest times, approached with purposeful steps, his face etched with concern. The protagonist could feel the tension in the air, as if the very universe was holding its breath in anticipation of what was about to transpire. The ally's voice broke the silence. "You've been distant lately," he said, his words heavy with unspoken meaning. "Is there something troubling you?" It was the moment the protagonist had been dreading. He knew what needed to be done, but the words seemed to stick in his throat, trapped by fear, doubt, and the crushing weight of the prophecy. How could he even begin to confront the man who might soon become his greatest adversary? "I've been thinking," the protagonist replied slowly, his voice thick with hesitation. "About everything. About what's to come." The ally's brow furrowed. "What are you saying?" The protagonist's heart pounded in his chest. The air seemed to close in around him as he struggled to find the courage to speak. Finally, the words spilled out in a rush. "The prophecy has spoken. It says that one of us will betray the other. I don't know who it is yet, but I can't shake the feeling that the time is near, and I can't ignore it any longer." For a long moment, the ally stood silent, his face unreadable in the fading light. The weight of the words hung heavily between them, and the protagonist could almost feel the world shifting beneath his feet. Would his closest ally confess? Would he reveal himself as the betrayer, or would the protagonist's fears blind him to the truth? The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sound of wind rustling the leaves of the trees. Finally, the ally spoke, his voice low and steady. "You're right," he said quietly. "The prophecy is inevitable, but we cannot allow it to define us. We must choose our path, no matter what the future holds." The words sent a chill through the protagonist's veins. The message was clear. The betrayal was not merely a matter of fate, it was a matter of choice. The ally was not denying the prophecy. He was acknowledging its power, while simultaneously urging the protagonist to take control of his destiny. The revelation that the prophecy was not a preordained script, but a looming challenge that both of them had to face, stirred something within the protagonist. He could no longer hide from it. This was his trial, and the time had come to confront it head-on. As the minutes ticked by, the protagonist stood in stunned silence, absorbing the gravity of his ally's words. He had hoped for clarity, but what he had received instead was a profound uncertainty that only deepened his internal struggle. The burden of knowing the truth, yet being unable to act on it, was both liberating and suffocating. It was now evident that he would have to make a choice. But what choice could he possibly make that would not destroy him or those around him? His gaze locked with his allies, and for the first time, the protagonist saw something new in his friend's eyes. A flicker of something darker, something more guarded. Was it guilt, fear, or something else entirely. The tension was palpable, thick in the air. It seemed as though the very atmosphere itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. "Whatever happens," the protagonist finally said, his voice firm despite the storm raging within him, "we have to stick together. I refuse to let this prophecy divide us. We've come too far for that." The ally nodded, but his expression remained unchanged, his eyes clouded with thoughts that the protagonist could not decipher. "We will," he said quietly. "We will stand together, no matter what." But in the back of the protagonist's mind, doubt lingered. The prophecy had spoken of betrayal. And even now, as he stood with his most trusted ally, he could not shake the feeling that the time was drawing near when the truth would come to light. And with it, a trial that neither of them would be prepared to face. As the night wore on, the protagonist found himself alone once more, the weight of the revelation still heavy on his chest. The world around him was unchanged, yet everything felt different. His path was no longer as clear as it once had been. There were no guarantees, only uncertainty, only the knowledge that the future was no longer something he could control. The turning point had arrived, and there was no turning back. The road to change is never an easy one, especially when the forces of the world seem stacked against you. After the pivotal turning point, where divine intervention or deep personal revelation sparked a desire for transformation, the protagonist steps into the battlefield of reform. With hope in their heart and a vision in their mind, they set out to challenge the very foundations of the world they once knew. But the road ahead is fraught with obstacles, opposition from enemies, resistance from allies, and inner turmoil as doubt begins to creep into their minds. This is the crucible that will shape their destiny. The first steps of the protagonist's journey are marked by bold yet cautious actions. They understand that true change will require more than just passion or desire. It will require careful planning, unwavering determination, and the ability to inspire others to take action alongside them. But the road is not smooth, and each action they take is met with resistance. Friends who were once eager to follow their lead now hesitate, unsure of the consequences. They begin to ask, "What will this cost us? Will this sacrifice be worth it?" The protagonist moves forward with a deep sense of purpose, knowing that to inspire others, they must first demonstrate their resolve. They start by addressing the small injustices, the overlooked corners of society where the most vulnerable are forgotten. The protagonist begins by rallying the poor, the marginalized, and those most affected by the existing system. They reach out to these people, speaking words of hope, change, and possibility. Slowly, they begin to garner a following, but their actions are not without consequences. As the protagonist steps deeper into their mission, their enemies begin to take notice. Powerful figures, those whose positions would be threatened by this call for reform, begin to make their move. They start by subtly undermining the protagonist's efforts. They sow doubt among the people, planting seeds of suspicion in their minds. Is this leader truly as righteous as they claim? What if this path leads us into even darker times? The protagonist's every move is scrutinized, and soon they realize that those who were once their allies are beginning to retreat into the shadows. Yet even in the face of mounting opposition, the protagonist does not waver. They double down on their mission, determined to bring justice to those who have suffered for far too long. Their words become sharper, their actions more decisive. It becomes clear that this is not a battle of convenience, but a matter of moral obligation. The world may oppose them, but they will not falter. The protagonist's growing influence begins to stir the waters of power. Political figures, religious leaders, and wealthy elites, people who have a stake in maintaining the status quo, begin to feel threatened. They are not concerned with the plight of the oppressed or the truth of the protagonist's message. Their primary concern is their survival, and the protagonist's call for reform threatens everything they've worked to build. As a result, they begin to push back harder. Opposition takes many forms. Public criticism intensifies. Lies are spread, painting the protagonist as a radical, a troublemaker, or even a dangerous revolutionary. Friends who once pledged their loyalty now distance themselves, unwilling to risk their safety and reputations. This sense of isolation weighs heavily on the protagonist. Every night they question their mission. Is this what it takes to change the world? Am I making a mistake? But within the protagonist, there is a fire that cannot be extinguished. They remember the moment of divine revelation, the burning clarity that told them to follow this path. They cannot let go of that vision. They cannot turn away from the people who are waiting for change. With each passing day, the weight of their responsibility grows heavier, but so does their resolve. As they face mounting challenges, the protagonist begins to understand something crucial. Change will never come easily, and the road ahead will not be smooth. Their enemies may try to silence them, and their friends may abandon them, but the truth remains. What they are fighting for is greater than their comfort, their safety, or even their future. They are fighting for a new world, one where justice, compassion, and righteousness are the cornerstones of society. In the face of adversity, the protagonist finds new strength. They begin to surround themselves with a loyal group of followers, those who are not swayed by the promises of the powerful, but who share their vision of a better world. This group becomes the foundation of the movement, a band of rebels united by a common cause. Together, they begin to fight not just for reform, but for a revolution. The struggle for justice will be long and grueling, but the protagonist now knows that they cannot do it alone. The enemy's attacks grow more sophisticated. They no longer rely solely on public criticism, but begin to engage in covert tactics. Assassinations, threats, and betrayals become a real and present danger. The protagonist is forced to navigate a web of deception where even those closest to them may turn out to be spies, traitors, or simply people who cannot bear the weight of this revolution. But through it all, the protagonist holds firm to their belief. The weight of their actions becomes clearer. They are not simply challenging the status quo. They are challenging the very structure of the world. This is no longer just a battle for political power or social reform. It is a war for the soul of society, for the heart of humanity. The story intensifies. The protagonist realizes that their reforms cannot be implemented with just words or policies. They must be backed by action, sacrifice, and courage. The people will follow them, but only if they can prove their sacrifice, only if they are willing to give everything for this cause. As their resolve hardens, the protagonist faces their first true test. The scales are tipping, their enemies grow more desperate, and their followers grow bolder. The time has come for the protagonist to face their biggest challenge yet, one that will determine whether they will succeed or fail in their mission. But even as the final moments of this chapter approach, there is a lingering question. Will the protagonist's vision be enough to overcome the forces that oppose them? Will they be able to bring about the change they so desperately seek? Only time will tell. The protagonist's resolve is put to the test as the forces arrayed against them grow increasingly ruthless. At first, the attacks were covert. Whispers in the streets, rumors in the taverns, a subtle campaign to undermine their influence. But now, the opposition is more overt and more violent. As the movement gains momentum, those in power become desperate to silence the voice of change. The protagonist is no longer merely an inconvenience to the status quo, they are a threat. The first of many betrayals comes swiftly. A trusted advisor, someone who had stood by the protagonist since the beginning, is revealed to have been working with the enemy all along. This betrayal cuts deep, for the protagonist trusted this individual with their very heart. The weight of this deceit threatens to shatter everything they've worked for. They begin to question every decision they've made. How could they have been so blind? Was it foolish to trust anyone in such dangerous times? But amid despair, the protagonist remembers the people, those they fight for. The oppressed, the forgotten, the downtrodden. These are the ones who need them now. The protagonist knows that they cannot afford the luxury of doubt. They cannot give in to the weight of betrayal, for the cause is too great. They rally their closest allies, the few who remain steadfast in their belief that change is possible. With each passing day, the protagonist grows more determined. They no longer rely on words alone, but take action in ways that shake the very foundations of the system. The protests and demonstrations grow more frequent and more passionate. The people are no longer passive observers, they are becoming active participants in the revolution. And with each act of defiance, the protagonist's vision begins to crystallize. This is no longer about a single leader. It is about a movement that will sweep across the land, reshaping the world in the name of justice. The movement begins to gather international attention. Word of the protagonist's fight for reform reaches far beyond their homeland. Allies from distant lands, from nations that have long been oppressed themselves, offer their support. Letters of encouragement, supplies, and even reinforcements arrive from unexpected places. These acts of solidarity renew the protagonist's hope, proving that the struggle is not isolated, but part of a larger global movement for justice. But the enemy does not sit idle. The ruling powers, now aware of the growing strength of the movement, began to escalate their attacks. They stop hiding behind subtle manipulations and instead resort to brute force. Soldiers are sent into the streets to quell the protests, to intimidate the people into silence. Public executions, forced disappearances, and mass arrests become a common sight. The bloodshed is unbearable. The cries of the oppressed are drowned out by the sounds of violence and cruelty. For the protagonist, this is the breaking point. The cost of reform is higher than they ever imagined. Lives are lost, dreams are shattered. And yet, the protagonist's spirit does not waver. It is in these dark moments that they understand the true nature of the fight they are in. This is not just about changing a political system. It is about confronting the very evil that has corrupted the world. The struggle is not only for justice, it is a battle for the soul of humanity. The protagonist's next move is one of sheer courage. Knowing full well the risks, they decide to face the enemy head-on. They take to the streets themselves, leading the people in direct opposition to the forces that seek to crush them. It is a moment of intense personal sacrifice. The protagonist is not only putting their own life at risk, they are putting the lives of their followers in jeopardy as well. But it is a risk they are willing to take. As they march through the streets, the protagonist is met with a mixture of fear and hope in the eyes of the people. Some are afraid of the consequences, afraid of the violence that may ensue. But others look upon the protagonist with admiration and awe. They see in the protagonist not just a leader, but a symbol of hope. The protagonist becomes more than just a person. They become a movement, an idea that will never be silenced, no matter the cost. But the forces arrayed against them are not easily defeated. The confrontation with the enemy is fierce and unforgiving. The streets are filled with chaos. The cries of the people echo through the air as the sounds of battle rage around them. In this moment, the protagonist faces the harsh reality of the struggle. The fight for change is not clean or easy. It is a bloody, brutal battle that requires not only physical strength, but moral courage. Despite the overwhelming odds, the protagonist continues to fight. They rally their followers, reminding them of the cause they fight for. The people rise with renewed determination, their voices united in a single cry for justice. The protagonist becomes the voice of the oppressed, their actions becoming a clarion call to all who hear. In that moment, they realize that they are not just leading a revolution, they are igniting a fire that will burn for generations to come. But the toll of the battle begins to show. The protagonist's body is bruised, bloodied, and weary. The pain is unbearable, but they press on, knowing that the cost of failure is far greater than the cost of sacrifice. They are reminded of the people who believed in them, the lives that were lost along the way, and the vision they hold for a better world. As the battle rages on, the protagonist begins to understand the true weight of their journey. It is not just about winning the fight, it is about standing firm in the face of overwhelming odds. It is about fighting for what is right, no matter the consequences, and it is about inspiring others to join the fight, to rise and demand a world where justice, freedom, and equality are not just ideals, but realities. The battle reaches its peak, and the protagonist faces their most intense challenge yet. The enemy, seeing that they cannot easily quell the rebellion, resorts to desperate measures. They begin to target not only the protagonist's movement, but also their closest allies and family. The protagonist's connections are now at risk. Those who have been with them since the beginning, who have offered unwavering support, are now under threat. Every leader in the movement is targeted, and the toll on the protagonist's inner circle is profound. One of the most heartbreaking moments comes when the protagonist's closest friend, someone they had trusted like a sibling, is captured by the enemy. The betrayal stings deeper than any physical wound. This friend had been a pillar of strength, a voice of reason when the protagonist had been overwhelmed by doubt. The thought of losing them, especially after all they had been through together, feels like a crushing blow. The protagonist is forced to confront the brutal reality that in the fight for justice, no one is exempt from the consequences. There are sacrifices, and some are more painful than others. But even as this personal loss devastates the protagonist, it becomes a turning point in their resolve. They realize that the movement cannot be about any one individual, not even themselves. It is about the people. The moment they chose to lead this cause, they set aside their desires and placed the needs of the many above their own. The fight for freedom, for justice, must continue, no matter the cost. Amid this turmoil, an unexpected opportunity arises. The protagonist learns of a secret meeting where the enemy leaders are planning their next steps. The protagonist knows that this could be the key to turning the tide. It's an opportunity that could potentially weaken the enemy's resolve and give the movement a strategic advantage. However, it comes with significant risks. The protagonist must infiltrate the enemy's stronghold, a dangerous and heavily guarded place, to gain the intelligence needed to shift the balance of power. The decision is not an easy one. It requires a level of courage that the protagonist hasn't yet tested. They must venture into enemy territory, knowing full well that failure could mean their capture or worse. But the cause they fight for is bigger than their fear. In that moment, the protagonist makes a choice that will alter the course of the revolution. They must act quickly, and they must be strategic. Gathering a small, trusted group of followers, the protagonist sneaks into the heart of the enemy's stronghold under the cover of darkness. The mission is fraught with danger. Every step is calculated and every move is measured. The air is thick with tension as they move through enemy territory, knowing that discovery means certain death. Every creak of a floorboard, every whisper in the night seems like a potential threat. Yet, the protagonist presses on, the weight of their mission driving them forward. After what feels like an eternity, they finally reach the meeting room where the enemy leaders are gathered. The room is dimly lit, filled with men and women whose faces betray no emotion. They speak in hushed tones, discussing their next steps, how to crush the movement once and for all. The enemy is planning their final push to extinguish any hope of rebellion. The protagonist, with their heart racing, listens intently. Every word spoken in that room is a revelation. They learn of a betrayal within their ranks. An ally they had trusted is secretly working with the enemy, feeding them information. The shock is overwhelming. The protagonist's sense of betrayal deepens, but they hold their emotions in check. This is not the time for vengeance. It is the time for action. They memorize every detail, knowing that this information could change everything. The hope of winning this revolution now lies in their hands. As they make their escape, the tension is unbearable. Every moment feels like it could be their last. The sounds of guards patrolling the halls grow louder, and the protagonist knows they must hurry. With their mission complete, they return to their followers, but not without a cost. One of their companions has been gravely injured, and the protagonist is once again reminded of the human toll that comes with such a high-stakes fight. Upon returning to the safety of their base, the protagonist shares the intelligence they've gathered with their leaders. The betrayal within their ranks is a blow to morale, but it also provides the catalyst for change. The protagonist knows that they cannot allow such treachery to go unpunished, but more importantly, they must use this knowledge to their advantage. The revolution enters its final phase. With the information gained from the enemy's meeting, the protagonist strategizes their next move. The enemy, now fully aware of the strength of the rebellion, begins to crack. The people, emboldened by the protagonist's actions, rise like never before. The streets are filled with cries of hope, defiance, and unity. The enemy begins to crumble under the weight of their corruption. Their power, once seemingly invincible, begins to falter. In the final confrontation, the protagonist stands at the forefront, facing down their enemies. It is a battle like no other, a culmination of years of struggle and sacrifice. The protagonist is no longer the unsure leader they once were. They are a symbol of resilience, of unwavering conviction. Every step taken in this final fight is a step toward a better world. The fight for freedom, for justice, has not been in vain. As the battle reaches its peak, the protagonist's enemies are forced to retreat. Their once unyielding hold on power is broken. The protagonist has won, but the cost has been high. Lives have been lost. The scars of war are visible in every face, every soul that fought for this cause. And yet, there is a sense of victory in the air. The protagonist has led their people to freedom, and with that comes the hope of rebuilding a world that is just, fair, and free from tyranny. The final moments of the struggle are bittersweet. The protagonist stands victorious, but weary. Their journey is far from over, but they have accomplished what they set out to do. The revolution is complete, and the world they fought for is beginning to take shape. In the quiet aftermath, the protagonist reflects on the path they've walked, knowing that they have changed the world forever. The final battle loomed ahead, and the weight of the prophecy pressed heavily on the protagonist's shoulders. As they stood before the vast desert, with the mountains in the distance casting long shadows, the air was thick with the smell of impending change. Every step forward felt like a clash between past failures and future redemption. The time had come to face the darkness within and the enemies without. The protagonist's mind raced. Could they truly rise to the occasion? All their doubts, fears, and mistakes had led them here. Yet in the quiet moments before the storm, there was a strange peace, a sense of inevitability. The battle was no longer just against enemies, but against their inner turmoil. In the heart of the battlefield, the forces of light and darkness would converge. The protagonist, armed not only with weapons, but with the weight of their spiritual journey, prepared for the test. The enemies were numerous, but the real battle was within, against the self-doubt that had plagued them for so long. Would their faith hold? Or would they succumb to the darkness that had claimed so many before them? As the sun dipped below the horizon, the first wave of enemies appeared. The protagonist's allies, though fewer in number, were ready. Their courage was born not from their might, but from their shared belief in the cause. Together, they faced the approaching storm with grim determination. The battle commenced with a deafening roar, the clash of metal on metal filling the air. Every strike, every shield raised, echoed the protagonist's internal struggle. As the fight raged on, memories flooded their mind, moments of failure, betrayal, and loss. Yet in these very memories lay the strength to fight on. The protagonists remembered the teachings of their mentors, the love of those who had believed in them, and the sacred trust bestowed upon them by God. These forces gave them the courage to move forward, despite the weight of their burdens. It was in the midst of the battle that the protagonist encountered the greatest enemy, a former ally, now turned traitor. This figure, once a friend, now stood in opposition, their face twisted with anger and betrayal. The confrontation was inevitable. As the protagonist faced this bitter enemy, the weight of past decisions came crashing down. The darkness within them threatened to break free, but a voice, faint yet unwavering, reminded them of their true purpose. "You were chosen for a reason," the voice whispered, barely audible over the clashing swords. "You have the strength to overcome this. Remember who you are." With newfound resolve, the protagonist confronted their betrayer. The clash was not just physical, but spiritual. Each strike was a confrontation between the past and the future, between redemption and damnation. In the end, it was not the sword that would determine the outcome, but the will to forgive, to rise above the darkness, and to embrace the light. As the battle drew to a close, the protagonist stood victorious, though not without scars, both visible and invisible. The world had been saved, but the journey was far from over. There was still much to learn, and the future remained uncertain. Yet, in that moment of triumph, the protagonist understood something profound. Redemption was not a destination, but a continuous struggle. They had faced the darkness within and emerged stronger, but they knew that the path ahead would always be filled with challenges. The enemy was defeated, but the war was far from over. The protagonist, now a leader, had to guide the people through the aftermath. The wounds of battle were deep, and the road to healing would require more than just physical strength. It would require faith, wisdom, and the ability to forgive. The resolution was not a singular event, but a process. The real victory lay in the protagonist's ability to lead their people toward a future that embraced both their triumphs and their scars. As the protagonist stood at the edge of the battlefield, the dawn broke. The first light of a new day touched the earth, symbolizing the hope that had been restored. The world would never be the same, but it could still be rebuilt. The protagonist, standing amid a broken world, now saw the possibilities ahead. The victory was not just in the battle won, but in the soul that had been restored. Redemption, they realized, was not a one-time act, but a lifelong journey. One that required sacrifice, growth, and the courage to continue despite the odds. The protagonist's victory was hard-earned, but it was only the beginning of the healing process. The aftermath of the battle was overwhelming, a landscape scarred by violence, both physical and spiritual. The once vibrant land now lay in ruins, and the people who had fought so hard were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. As the protagonist walked through the desolate battlefield, their mind echoed with the weight of what had been lost and what had been gained. In the wake of victory, the protagonist was faced with a question: what now? The battle had been won, but the war was not over. Redemption was a continuous journey, and the people too needed to heal. They needed guidance, hope, and leadership to navigate the uncertain path ahead. The protagonist understood that it wasn't just their soul that had been saved, but the fate of the world that had been entrusted to them. The responsibility felt heavier than ever before. But amid the destruction, there were signs of hope. The protagonist witnessed small acts of kindness, wounded soldiers helping one another, broken families coming together, and communities rebuilding from the ashes. Though the scars of war would never fully fade, these gestures of unity were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The protagonist returned to their people, their hearts heavy with the burden of leadership. It was clear that they would have to lead not with the sword, but with wisdom and compassion. The final battle had been a test of strength, but now the true test began. How would they rebuild what had been broken? How could they restore the faith of those who had seen so much darkness? In the days that followed, the protagonist addressed the people with unwavering resolve. The speeches were not of glory or triumph, but of unity and reconciliation. They spoke not as a conqueror, but as a servant, a leader, committed to rebuilding the world. The protagonist shared their struggles and failures, showing vulnerability that earned the trust of the people. They spoke of the importance of faith, not just in the divine, but in each other. It was this bond, the shared belief in something greater than themselves, that would carry them forward. But as the days passed, it became clear that the protagonist's journey was far from over. The remnants of the enemy still lurked in the shadows, waiting to strike again. They had been defeated, but their ideology, their darkness, still poisoned the hearts of some. There were whispers of dissent, of resistance, and the protagonist knew that the peace they had fought for was fragile. The scars of war ran deep, and the healing process would be slow. The protagonists sought counsel from their most trusted advisors, those who had fought beside them through every trial. Together, they began to lay the groundwork for a new world, a world where justice, peace, and redemption could flourish. They understood that this would not be an easy task, but they were ready to fight, not with weapons, but with faith, wisdom, and love. It was in these quiet moments, when the world seemed still, that the protagonist found themselves reflecting on their journey. They thought back to the early days when they had felt weak and uncertain, when the burden of leadership seemed too great to bear. They had faced impossible odds, both external and internal, and yet here they stood, a testament to the power of redemption and the strength of the human spirit. The protagonist realized that the battle was never truly about defeating external enemies. It was about overcoming the darkness within. It was about facing the doubts, fears, and weaknesses that had threatened to destroy them. It was about choosing light over darkness, hope over despair, and love over hate. As the protagonists continued their work, they encountered others who, like them, had suffered great loss. There were those who had lost family, friends, and everything they held dear. These individuals came to the protagonist seeking solace, understanding, and guidance. In these moments, the protagonist found that their greatest strength was not their power to lead armies, but their ability to listen, empathize, and offer hope. In each person they helped, the protagonists saw a reflection of themselves. The same struggle, the same pain, the same desire for redemption. They understood that this was their true calling, not just to be a leader, but to be a healer, a guide, and a source of hope for those who had lost their way. The protagonist's transformation was not just a personal one, it was shared by those around them. Slowly but surely, the world began to heal. Communities were rebuilt, families were reunited, and faith was restored. The wounds of the past were not forgotten, but they became a reminder of what had been overcome. The protagonist had not just led their people to victory, they had led them to a new understanding of themselves and their world. But even as peace began to take root, the protagonist knew that the future was uncertain. There will always be challenges, always be enemies, and always be struggles. But they had learned something invaluable. The true strength lay not in never falling, but in rising every time they did. The journey of redemption was not linear. It was a constant, ever-evolving process. And the protagonist had learned to embrace the journey, no matter how difficult it might be. The final moments of this section were filled with a quiet reflection. The protagonist stood on a hill overlooking the world they had helped save, watching the sunset in a new era. There was no grand celebration, no victory parade, only the calm certainty that they had done what they could. They had fought for a better world, and though they couldn't change the past, they had created a future filled with hope. The protagonist had not only fulfilled their mission, they had discovered a deeper purpose: to lead with love, to serve with humility, and to continue the fight for redemption, not for themselves, but for the world. The legacy of their journey would live on, carried in the hearts of those they had touched, and in the faith they had rekindled in the world. As we reach the end of this incredible journey through the life of the protagonist, we are left to reflect on the powerful lessons woven throughout their trials, triumphs, and ultimate transformation. Their story is not just one of overcoming external challenges, but of grappling with the deepest parts of themselves, confronting fears, doubts, and weaknesses that all of us face at some point in our own lives. Imagine yourself standing in their shoes, facing seemingly insurmountable odds. Could you summon the courage to stand tall, to resist the temptations of despair and surrender just as they did? When life seemed darkest, when the weight of the world threatened to crush them, they did not yield. Instead, they rose, finding strength not only from within, but from a higher purpose, a deeper connection that guided their every step. Now, think about the moments in your own life when you felt overwhelmed. The moments where you doubted yourself, where the world seemed too harsh, and your spirit felt broken. Could you have found the courage to rise as they did? Could you have found the strength to face your fears head-on and turn them into stepping stones toward greatness? This story isn't just theirs, it's ours. The journey of transformation is not an isolated path. It is a shared experience that resonates with each one of us, no matter where we are in life. The protagonist's story serves as a mirror, reflecting the potential for change, the possibility of redemption, and the hope that we too can overcome any obstacle. Their journey teaches us that even in our weakest moments, when all seems lost, there is always a way forward, a path that leads to personal growth, a path that brings us closer to who we were always meant to be. Just as they discovered strength in their darkest moments, we too have the power to unlock that inner strength within ourselves. The call to action is simple yet profound. Reflect on your own life. Are you living in alignment with your highest purpose? Are you facing your fears or allowing them to control you? It's never too late to start again, to embrace the change you've been avoiding, and to step into the life you are truly capable of creating. As you move forward, remember that you are never alone on this journey. Just as the protagonist had mentors, allies, and moments of divine intervention to guide them, you too have access to support, wisdom, and the strength to change your life. Whether through community, faith, or self-reflection, the tools are available to help you walk the path of transformation with courage and clarity. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on the lessons it holds for you. What are the obstacles you need to face? What are the fears that need to be conquered? And most importantly, what steps can you take today to begin your journey toward personal growth and redemption? As the protagonist's story was one of hope, so too can your life be a story of overcoming, a testament to the power of resilience and transformation. Now, it's time for you to embrace that story, take action, and become the hero of your narrative. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, someone who may be walking through their darkness. Let this message ripple out into the world, touching others in ways you may never fully see, but will always feel. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories, insights, and reflections. Stay connected, stay inspired, and remember that your story is still being written. Subscribe now to continue your journey of transformation with us.